So you finally have a product or service that you want to sell. You've come up with a name, you've set up your store, and you're ready to start selling. But the one thing holding you back is how do you actually price your stuff? In my experience, pricing can be one of the things that either make or break a store. It can be the difference between getting no sales at all and having so many sales that you just can't keep up. And I feel that the majority of shops, especially on Etsy, aren't pricing their products in the best way. If you're new to the channel, my name's Tim and I run a sticker shop on Etsy and Shopify. I've gotten over 6,000 sales and have made over 6 figures doing this as a side hustle. On this channel, I make videos documenting my journey of entrepreneurship and sharing everything I've learned. So if you're into that thing, feel free to subscribe. So when you're coming up with prices for your products, there's really only 2 ways to go about it. You can either base it on something or you can base it on nothing. And before I get to basing it on specific things, I want to talk about basing it on nothing because as silly as it sounds, it's actually a viable strategy. For nothing pricing, all you're really doing is picking a number off the top of your head that you'd be happy to work for, and you're setting that as your price. Because most of you are doing this as a side hustle. And what's the point of a side hustle if you're not happy with the amount of money that you're making? So pick a random price as a starting point and put it up on Etsy and start asking people in person if they're willing to pay that price. With this method, the best way to gauge on whether or not you actually have a solid price is your sales. If there's a lot of people saying no to your prices or you're not getting any sales at all, it's likely that your prices are too high. On the other side, if everyone is saying yes to your prices right away, it might be a sign that your prices are too low and you could be leaving money on the table. So the best thing to do is to experiment with it a little bit and to take note of the amount of yeses and nos you're getting and adjust accordingly. Now that we're done with nothing, let's get to real specific things that you can base your prices on. And the first one is the one that I think 95% of Etsy shops are doing, and that's competitor pricing. Let's say you're a new shop selling candles. What most people do is they go on Etsy, look at all the competitor candle shops out there, take an average of all the prices they see, and price their candles slightly lower than the average. While this might work on other platforms, I feel like pricing this way is actually a mistake, specifically on Etsy. And I'm gonna talk about why a little bit later, but first I wanna talk about the general cons of this pricing method. The first one is that it doesn't take into account the uniqueness of your product. I've said this in previous videos, but if you wanna beat the competition, you have to stand out in some way. And by pricing your products exactly the same as everyone else, you're signaling to your customers that you're just the same as everybody else. Secondly, pricing this way can attract some of the worst customers. Customers looking to buy things for the lowest price possible are generally the hardest to please, and usually the least loyal. While you might get a sale initially, as soon as they see another shop selling for a lower price, they're gonna jump ship and start shopping there. Another issue with competitor pricing is that when too many stores are doing this, eventually everything goes to zero and nobody makes money. If you've spent any time shopping on Etsy, I'm sure you've seen stores that are selling products for so ridiculously low that there's no way that they're making money. I've seen physical art prints sell for less than $10, jewelry for less than $5, and greeting cards and stickers for less than $0.25, which is just nuts to me. But the real reason I feel that competitor pricing is such a big mistake on Etsy specifically is because of how Etsy aggressively promotes competition. Say you're selling a product on Etsy and you direct a customer to your listing page to buy something. If your customer scrolls just a little bit, they'll see 12 similar products and prices from competing stores right on the same page as yours. This would be like if you're shopping for a jacket at the mall, and the moment you pick up a jacket to take a closer look, 12 other jackets pop up for you to look at. And if you take a look at one of those jackets, 12 more jackets pop up. While I feel like some customers might like this, I feel like this feature really amplifies all the cons that I've listed before. I'll admit that this feature is helpful for customers trying to get a deal, but it's not so great for the shops that are trying to compete and for the shops that are trying to make a living. You have to wonder then, with all the negatives there are, why are the majority of shops pricing this way? Well, there are benefits to this method, and the first one is that it's really simple to start. All it takes is just a little bit of time to browse Etsy, look for your competitors in a niche, and take note of all of their prices. Then you just average out what everyone is charging and you price somewhere around there. It's a simple formula that anyone can do, and you don't have to spend time experimenting with changing your prices to try to find the sweet spot. Secondly, you can actually see evidence for sales at a certain price point. When you're starting a new business, there's so much uncertainty that you have to think about, and pricing this way can really put a lot of entrepreneurs' minds at ease. They can actually see other businesses selling at this price, so they at least know that it's possible. Thirdly, I think competitor pricing is just the first thing that comes to mind. It's the most obvious proven method of setting a price. But there's actually a whole lot of other ways that you can come up with a price, and I'm gonna get into the next one now. Cost-based pricing is exactly what it sounds like. It's adding up all the costs associated with making your product, including your time, and applying a markup percentage to reach a certain asking price. For example, let's say you're selling something physical and your costs break down like this. Materials are $10, your labor is $35, shipping is $5, marketing and fees are $10, which brings the total cost to $60. You then apply a markup percentage. Let's go with somewhere between 50 and 100%. This would bring us to a $90 to $120 asking price. So the first question that I get asked here is, what percentage do I use? And honestly, there are no set rules for markup percentages, so it's something that you're going to have to experiment with. If you're looking for a starting point, most direct-to-consumer brands mark up between 50 to 100%. But again, that's not a set rule because there are some luxury brands that will mark up anywhere between 500 and 2,000%. Here are some reasons I prefer cost-based pricing to competitor pricing. And the first one is that you'll actually be making money. If you're blindly copying a competitor's prices and you're not keeping track of your costs, it's possible that over time you may actually be losing money. This might sound like a mistake that's easy to avoid, but I've actually seen it happen. Since costs and income come at different times, it's actually more common than you think. With cost-based pricing, you're consistently making money on every sale that you make. Every sale covers its costs. Secondly, it's simple to figure out. You should already be tracking your costs. If you're not, this is your sign to start doing so now. To get to an asking price, all you're doing is adding everything up and applying a markup. Lastly, it's easy to justify your price. There's no price gouging here. If you have an industry standard markup, all your prices are fair and non-discriminatory. If you have to increase your prices, it's because your costs went up, and it can be easier to communicate with your customers in this way. Nothing's perfect though, and I'm going to be talking about some of the downsides now. And the first one is that it doesn't take into account customer demand. If the demand for your products are low, you're not going to get any sales. And on the flip side, if the demand is high, again, you'll be leaving money on the table. Secondly, it might not be the best pricing method if there's a big gap between what your product costs and the value it provides to your customers, which leads us to the next way of pricing products. Storytime. A couple of years ago, our furnace broke down at the start of winter. I think the forecast for that following night was supposed to hit some -20 or somewhere around there. We were new parents with a really young baby, and obviously we were kind of starting to freak out. I was mentally preparing for the worst, thinking we'd have to huddle up in sleeping bags to try to keep our body temperatures up. We called a couple furnace places and we were expecting to pay thousands of dollars and maybe a couple days to get it fixed. But we were able to find someone who could come look at it right away. But thankfully, it was just a small part with like the ignition system that only costed us $100 to fix. I bring up this story because that small part that could fix the furnace probably only cost the furnace guy like 10 bucks or maybe even less. But the value that he provided to us was worth thousands of dollars to us. Having a warm home when the weather is freezing outside, especially when you're dealing with all the stress of having a new baby, was worth so much more than that, and I was willing to spend much more. This is why a lot of businesses these days are opting for value-based pricing, which is setting a price based on the perceived value that a customer gets. So here's some key points about this method. Unlike with cost-based pricing, value-based pricing is based on the perceived value that somebody's getting, and that's gonna differ from customer to customer. That means if you wanna use this type of pricing, you really have to do your research and understand your customers. You have to start thinking in terms of what problems are your customers having, and what is a solution worth to them. Also, how does it compare with other solutions that they might consider? Usually, there's a lot of different ways to solve a problem, and if your solution to a problem is expensive or complex, customers might opt for a cheaper solution. If you're going for value-based pricing, one thing that you can't ignore is brand. Building a brand with a message that is able to connect with your customers can add value to a product all by itself. You can see this with brands like Nike or Supreme. A plain white t-shirt is a commodity that costs a few dollars to make. But if you add a logo to it, suddenly you can sell it for 50 or even hundreds of dollars. The logo adds so much more than the cost of the ink it takes to put on the t-shirt. It really communicates a story or a promise or a set of values that these companies have built over time. And customers are willing to pay more for that because they see that as valuable. Like with the other methods, everything has pros and cons, but I'm gonna start with the pros. And the first one is that if you're doing it right, it can lead to higher profits. When you're thinking about business this way, you're really only limited to the amount of value that you can provide. Businesses that provide the most value will earn the most profit. Secondly, pricing this way usually leads to better customer alignment. Unlike other methods where you're more focused about your competitors or your costs, value-based pricing makes you more focused on your customers. Success comes from understanding your customers' needs and wants. Some of the cons of value-based pricing are that it's really complex. It's not as straightforward as other methods where you can take proven data points and use some kind of formula to come up with a price. You can actually get value-based pricing wrong. If you overestimate the amount of value that you're giving to your customers, they're not going to buy. Or even if they do buy, some of them might be unsatisfied with the solution and might leave you negative reviews. Secondly, you have to deal with market segmentation problems. Different segments of the market are going to perceive value differently, and that means that you may have to have different versions of your products if you want to satisfy them all. For example, Apple sells a variety of computers from basic to pro to try to satisfy all markets, because not everyone's going to perceive their high-end products as worth it. I think the important thing to remember here is that pricing doesn't need to be set in stone. It's another aspect of your business, and it's something that you're going to have to experiment with, especially if you're new to it. Just because you pick a certain price day one doesn't mean you have to stick with it forever. Even some of the biggest companies in the world change their prices all the time. I remember back when Nintendo launched the 3DS, sales were lower than they expected, and they realized that they misread the market. To turn things around, they actually reduced their price from $250 to $170 just 4 months after they released it. So if you're still hung up on pricing and it's causing you a lot of stress and it's stopping you from starting a business, my suggestion would be just to start with nothing pricing and go from there. You never know what might happen. And if you like this video and you're still looking for ideas for products that you can make and sell, you can check out this video over here. If not, thanks so much for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.